Good afternoon.
Okay, welcome to the Alumni Talk. We still have a number of participants that are joining. We are 19 so far, but I can still see some more that are joining this Alumni Talk. So I just want to take this opportunity to thank all of you that registered to be part and parcel of this important Alumni Talk. Looking at the topic, sustaining governance reforms beyond project support. This is a topic that doesn't just apply to the support that ICLD has provided to all of us, but any other support, whether it's from central government, for those that are in local government, or any other cooperating partner. So thank you for making the time to be here. So I will start by introducing our guest speaker. Our guest speaker is Mr. Wilfred K. Mwamba. He prefers to be called Wilf. If you were able to read through the profile that was shared on the ICLD page, Mr. Mwamba has vast experience, having worked for FCDO, which was DFID, as it was called then, the British International Development Agents, for 22 years. Beyond that, he also served as a chief of party for a project that was funded by USAID. So in the 22 years, he worked with DFID. He worked in East Africa, Congo, sometimes Rwanda, but he also worked in West Africa. So he has vast experience from supporting a lot of governments to undertake reforms on the African continent. Currently, he is a principal consultant for the Policy Practice, which is a UK-based organization that does a lot of work on political economy and governance reforms. So in brief, that's what I wanted to share about our guest speaker for today. So maybe just to begin our Alumni Talk, I just have a few questions that I would like to ask our guest speaker to respond to as he goes into his presentation. And my first question to our guest speaker is basically, how do we ensure that the reforms that the systems, the tools that are developed by ICLD and the other partners that we work with are sustained once project funding or external support comes to an end? So that is our main question. So at this moment, I'll allow our guest speaker to go ahead with his presentation as he answers this question. Thank you. Over to you, Mr. Mwamba or Wilf.
Thanks very, very much, Danny. Just confirming you can hear me.
Yes, I can. I don't know for the other people on the call.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thanks. Great pleasure to be invited to share some thoughts on this topic. I'm very passionate about reform, and I think it's really great to have the opportunity to share some of my thoughts. So Danny, you asked a question on, how do we ensure that the work that you've been doing on this project and indeed other projects survive beyond the project itself? And so I've titled this presentation, What Survives and Why? And I'll share with you a few, I'll call them tips from experience on the things or the characteristics that ensure that something that you start can survive. So the first thing I want to look at, or if technology allows me, I looked at your website, and I think a lot of the work that you've done is great work. You've done so much work collectively to produce very good tools. But every time that a project is coming to an end, you do get a sense that, maybe the tools that have been developed, the systems that have been developed will not survive. And so what I want us to look at, our focus today, is not necessarily the tools themselves. It's the ideas behind the tools and making sure that the tools, what you wanted to achieve with them is what remains and that can survive. Before we go there, let's look a bit at the current context we are in. Between 2023 and 2025, it's projected that, yes.
Sorry, excuse me. I've been trying to raise my hand because I wanted to let you know. Sorry to cut you. You're vibrating, so we can hardly hear you.
Oh, I see. Okay. And now?
I don't know whether you have another gadget that is open or something.
No, not me. Maybe there might be someone. Is anyone else experiencing the same problem?
No, I can hear you perfectly.
Can hear you clearly.
Then maybe it's a problem on my end. It's okay. Thank you. Okay. Thank you.
I think so, because you're vibrating when you talk. Please.
Okay, so I was just starting to talk about the context. There's a decline, particularly in governance funding since 2023, and that is projected to go, even more. If you look at the statement that the UK government has released about the priorities today, I didn't see any mention of governance. They talk about conflicts areas, they talk about fragile areas, they talk about women and girls growth. But if you see that, there isn't anything to talk about governance. And yet governance is really at the heart of a lot of the same things they want to sustain. So just as a context to keep in mind that the era of governance that we had, or support that we had from development partners, is reducing. And so the test or the governance reforms that we find fail are usually reforms that depend on a program support, on a cooperating partner or a donor. Those that are externally funded and driven, where you find no institutional routine is built and no domestic political protector is there. Usually those kinds of initiatives fail once the funding ends. So we don't want to be in that bracket. And we've also, I did a paper recently that I examined about 20 projects, and you find that the ones where reform stays are where the reformers, the people who are receiving the support, if you like, the people whose country it is, the people whose local government it is on the project, and the agency they remains with them. Those are the kind of project that we find sustained. So I call it locals owning the design. So you are supporting things that the locals themselves, public officials, citizens, politicians want to own, or the changes they want to see happen. There must be an element that there's financing from the partner. Usually when financing is totally left to an external funder, those reforms are hardly sustained. Usually, especially with things like tools, you have to ensure that staff routine is established, so they are embedded in what staff do, and it's not looked at as if this is an ICLD tool, for example, or an FCDO tool. It has to be something that the staff and the people who are using those tools, the people who are going to have to live with the reform, feel they can form routines around in their own work. And where there's citizen demand activated, usually we find that those kinds of reform persist even when a project is gone. So the bottom line is, when I looked at the ICLD, the tools are real. I mean, they're brilliant tools, right? But whether they survive is going to rely on how they are designed in new initiatives to continue doing what they were meant to do. Now, when I looked at your tools particularly, it's easy to think these are tools, but actually what they are doing is not what they're called. So let's have a look at some of the tools that you've developed. So you talk about the report card. It's an accountability reform. You know, you're changing whether feedback changes how decisions are made. You talk about the citizens' budget. It's a fiscal legitimacy question. You know, how do you build public trust in revenue decisions? SDG, localization, those are about the priorities that find themselves being funded. When you talk about peer learning, it's much more than just learning. It's actually a behavioral reform. How do we start learning from each other, where you have people who have done something before you that you can learn from? And then you look at gender and youth tools. These are not just tools about gender. They are actually tools about power. You know, how do you ensure that those who are disempowered feel much more empowered? So while we call them tools, the real reform is what's behind them. And it's really important that we keep that in mind. The tools can disappear, but hopefully what they were trying to achieve will be something that we can sustain. Just a sound check to make sure I'm still being heard by everyone, or at least a thumbs up. Good. All right. So if we treat the things that we've developed as tools, then all we do is manage them. And once we go, then they probably will go. So we have to remember that all these tools that we've developed are actually about the reform behind them. And that's the key thing, that one of the key messages I would like to, to suggest that you keep. The tools are only a means to a reform. And it's the reform that we want to sustain. So from the cases that I wrote about in my paper, there are 5 conditions that seem to align for a reform to survive. And these are not obviously, they're not the only ones, but these are the ones that were common in the cases that I examined. Right? So the first one is political utility. In order to have what we mean by political utility is that the reform someone needs the reform to succeed. And usually it's politicians or senior government officials, or someone demanding for that change. And so in this case, when we talk about political utility, it's not just about politicians, it's also about citizens. Because when they feel something is going to be able to make a change for them, make their lives better, then it's a reform that they want to see survive. The second one is institutional fit. You know, it has to work in real institutions. There's no point developing or trying to have a reform in a context where they do not have the means to make that reform work. You also want to ensure that there's real opportunities for those tools to be used. If you develop a budgeting or even a citizen budget tool and use it at a time when there's no budgeting going or happening, then the timing is what's wrong, and that's what kills the tool rather than the tool itself. So it's always ensuring that whatever we've developed is being used at the right time and with the right people. We're talking about people's lives here. So these are not tools that we're teaching people as you would have a textbook. These are tools for people to use in real life in order to impact people's lives. The third condition that I found was that there must be a connection to, or there must be fiscal anchorage within the institution that is promoting the tool. If everything is, and fiscal, let me just explain that fiscal anchorage doesn't mean the own money has to always be cash. Some of it is in kind, staff time. When a local government commits its own staff to do the work, that is time, that is a contribution because they believe in that. If it's all left to the cooperating partner or the donor, then it's really not going to happen because it's probably not a reform that those who are undertaking it believe in. So when you look at this, and we'll come to a kind of a pathway to make sure that this happens in a minute or so, these conditions are quite key in ensuring that reforms are well accepted in the locality or the context that they're being delivered. The fourth one is around the staff routine. I touched on this a bit, but if you are making a change, it has to be, you have to look at it holistically. The people who implement reform are staff, they're human beings. And if something isn't in my job description, for most of us, we will not do it. There must be something that will ensure that I'm held accountable for it and that, I also feel I'm being recognized for, because we are incentivized to perform where we'll be measured. So a lot of reform survives when those reforms are embedded in how staff do things, as well as how the institution, does things. So we have to make sure that as you think about reform, you're thinking about the whole of the institution, including the people. And finally, one of the other key areas that we found was, important was citizen demand. When people outside start to notice that something is missing and they ask for it, and part of that is it informs, number one, the political utility. Politicians care about what their voters care about. Not always, but especially going towards an election, they do. So you want to make sure that there's a demand for that reform. Otherwise, it won't survive. Or if it survives, it's only going to survive for the period that you have a few champions, and you don't want to build your reform around just champions. So let me pause there for just a few seconds. And if you think about some of the work that you're doing yourselves in your various areas, you look at your tools that you're using to implement those reforms, which of these conditions do you feel is weakest right now? You won't be answering the question at this point, but I just want you to reflect on that for a few seconds. Good. So just to close out or up on this, I would put these 5 conditions in probably three buckets. One is around power. Okay, does someone in authority need this? Do people who are impacted by this reform need it or want it? The second bucket is around systems, to make sure that they become institutionalized and become part of the routine. So that's where you have your 3 and 4, as well as, are there resources that ensure that this can be kept alive after the project goes. And through all of that, citizen demand becomes really important, especially because a lot of the work that we're talking about and the work that we do is around public interest. So going on, just going back to the cases that I documented, and I took the liberty of listening to your last webinar, and one of the discussions there was around the Know Your Neighbor, I think Lusaka, an initiative that was taken in Lusaka. So when I look at that and the conditions that we talked about, it began with a visible problem, right? Waste management and youth crime. And so that already started to give it some prominence, some political utility. Local politicians found that useful, and the communities also that had stopped trusting the council found that this was something they could come together publicly to work on a problem that they were concerned about, which gave it the political utility. It used existing structures, so it was embedded in the institution, in the routines of the staff at Lusaka Council. And then later on, CDF funded it, the Constituency Development Fund, which means it was resourced. And I think from the webinar, I heard that the communities have continued to use to use the slogans even to this day. So as you can see, that's one of the using an example from ICLD context where those 5 conditions were kind of met. If you look at the other examples, there's a Nigeria example, which also was very much focused on building coalitions around citizens, civil society, and the governments. And those reforms have continued to this day because they were anchored on things that people really cared about, similar ways to the online system that the Rwandan government has done. It's something that they wanted to do. Technical expertise was given to them to just, give them a bit of a push. It wasn't driven from the outside. It survived because the government wanted to digitize, but the public started feeling that this is something that works and makes life easier. And so it has survived despite having very little funding. On the other side, the cases that seem to have collapsed, the one in Uganda was a democratic governance facility that was very much funded by donors, and when donors left, it collapsed. The whole coalition was being kept alive because of donor funding. The Kenya PFM for counties, there was money thrown in to automate the PFM in the newly created counties. That too ran for a while, but as soon as funding ended, some of the counties reverted to using manual systems. It's not because they didn't want to, but because there's evidence that it was being seen as driven very much externally. In this group, we are lucky that you have practitioners, you have researchers, and you have people who are actually working in local government, in the context in which we work. And I'm very sure that most of the tools you've developed together. So the patterns are very clear that when you have domestic ownership and there's fiscal logic, meaning there's funding behind it that's local, those reforms will almost certainly survive. On the other side, if you have external control, the survival conditions are not there, and we find that those kinds of projects collapse. So in terms of the 5, moving from those 5 pathways to institutionalization, you have to start thinking from the very beginning. How do we get ownership? How do we get political ownership? How do we give leaders and the leadership of the institutions we work with the owners? How do we ensure a councillor, a mayor, or a town clerk would lose something if this thing stopped? To give a very quick example for those who follow decentralization in Zambia, when the new government came in 2021, they did talk about decentralization, but the decentralization policy wasn't theirs. Where supporting a government institution, they thought they needed to rewrite the policy. If you look at the policy as is now and the policy that was there before, a lot of it is the substance is largely the same, but they ensured that the language reflected what the new government wanted. And so just using some of those, that political acumen, they were able to make that decentralization owned by a new government who would otherwise have probably thrown the baby out with the bathwater, as they say. You need to start very early connecting to fiscal logic. So find the resource or a cost argument. How do you start to get local partners supporting some of these reforms very early in the reform process? And it doesn't mean they have to make a line that's specific on, for example, citizen budget. There are things that most local governments will already do. And so the tool is meant to enhance what they already do as a matter of process, and that's where you embed your reform. In terms of making sure that staff embed this, it's making sure that from the very beginning you make it someone's responsibility. So in going back to the work that when we had the USAID local impact project, one of the key things we really pushed was that we did not institute any reform without the local authorities themselves taking the lead. So rather than bringing in consultants, were brought in, if any, to come and empower the staff themselves. Every tool was developed with the local authority staff, and so they themselves owned the tools from the very beginning. And the project was there to support them to fulfill their mandate. Therefore, they always saw this as their responsibility. And if something isn't already in the job descriptions of staff, then you find that it does not work. So, whose quarterly work plan should this fit in? Who will be held accountable if this thing doesn't work? And if this is already owned by the institutions, usually you will find that they find a way of making sure that everyone who has the responsibility actually does it. It's not always easy, but making sure that from the very beginning, you have an interlocutor within the institution who owns it, that becomes a really good hook for institutionalization and keeping that reform alive when a project is finished. The fourth thing is around activating citizen demand, where you make the outputs visible and actionable. So you have tools such as the citizen budget. How do you ensure that citizens start to feel that this is not simply a nice to have, but something that should be happening, because the money that's being spent is public money to which they have a right to know how that money is being used, how the priorities are being made. When you empower young people to ensure that they can participate, and most of Africa, particularly with the youth bulge, we're finding that the population is very Gen Z. How are we ensuring that the Gen Z are not simply recipients of reform, but are part and parcel of the reform? And the fifth one is you need to start designing your exit if you are an outside organization from the very first time you enter. And especially now with the way that the overseas development assistance is going, you've got to think of an exit from the very first moment that you start to support any reform. So a key question I like to ask is any partner, how do we ensure that when we leave, if we leave in the next year or two, that what we're starting today can be institutionalized by the interlocutors, the partners that we're working with. So in terms of the presentation, this is it. And I leave you with this question, and we can pick up some of these themes, I think, in a discussion. Given the work that you have done as ICLD, collectively, alumni and the institution itself, could you lose the tools tomorrow? And would the reform carry on regardless? Because that really is the test. If the answer is yes, then you have institutionalized the tools. If no, then we have a design gap that we have to think through. And any design gap can be fixed, but we need to start thinking right now that the tools were only a means to get us to the reform that's behind those tools. And the reform can only be carried when it's truly owned by those who are going to have to implement the reform. Danny, I think that's all. That's it from me. Hopefully we can have a discussion and we can pick up on some of these points. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wilf, for that presentation. I think what we'll do is, I saw there was a question in the chat from Mr. Luchembe. Maybe we can start with that one. And then thereafter, whoever has a question, wants to speak, we'll ask you to raise your hand, and then we'll allow you to ask the question that you have. So we'll start with the question that is in the chat from Mr. Luchembe. I'm trying to just see if I can read it. Okay, so I don't know if you can see it, Wilf.
I can see it.
Maybe I can add context to the question, if I'm allowed. Yeah, so Wilf, you talked about political utility. I think one of the first points in the presentation, and I really appreciate that thought in terms of political utility. But then I was thinking, because I've seen and I've experienced this before. You come up with a tool, it's getting great results being used at the community level, local level. It's building people's interest to demand for possibly accountability and ensuring that the right questions are asked. But then in the same space, you have political players, opposition political parties, who pick those findings and sometimes politicize them. And in our context, I think in the Zambian context, in that manner, then as a civil society, who you're a neutral organization and you're non-partisan, but then you'll be considered, to be fueling opposition's agenda. So how do we ensure that the works that we are doing, the findings, the capacity that we are building at community level does not put us as civil society organizations working closely with government sometimes, but as sometimes also having a different opinion on how certain things are done, but still, use those findings to be objective and ensure that we remain resolute to the work that we are doing.
Thanks very much, Luchembe. It's not the tactics will always be context driven, right? So a lot of this, also requires that we have a very deep understanding of the context in which we work. In Zambia, as you say, criticizing the government publicly usually is not always the easiest thing, especially if you want to partner with them on other things. But closed-door meetings with them is very possible, and you can have those closed-door meetings where you have honest discussions. My experience usually is that when you have those discussions in private with them, tell them about the good, the bad, and the ugly. By the time things come out in the public or in the open, they are much more able to deal with them because they feel you haven't, what's the word, when you haven't caught them by surprise, and they do not feel that you're trying to sabotage them or catch them out. So that's in terms of the work, any work that you do on governance will always end up being politicized. But I think even with that, when there's truth and when you've been taking government along where you can, and if this is reform that needs their support and you work with them, there's usually ways that they too can also help you to understand how to deal with those maybe even higher up who may not always appreciate the accountability that comes from, say, civil society. So the main point on political utility is really spending time understanding, as you rightly pointed out, who are some of the blockers, who are some of the supporters, what political factors may hinder us from achieving our objectives. But instead of the objectives being for the civil society organizations, how do we make them a citizen objective? How do we make that reform so ingrained in the citizens that they want it? Sometimes it's building a critical mass of citizens around that reform. And I think sometimes that we underestimate the agency that citizens themselves have, which is why I said, citizens have to be thought through at every one of those 5 pathways to institutionalization. So understanding your context, being as transparent as you can with government. We ask for transparency from government. Civil society also needs to be as transparent, and knowing the wisdom to know when to talk publicly and when to fight in closed doors, where you can criticize, helps to build some of that political utility. And I think finally just building a critical mass of champions, not one champion, because reforms that are built on a champion rarely survive. If the champion is moved, that's the end of it. But building a critical mass from different stakeholders who you can use to champion the reform. So not perfect, but those are some of the experiences that I can share where it helps to build a wider appreciation.
Thank you very much. We have a hand from Abraham, please.
Good afternoon, Wilfred. Nice to see you again. For me, I wanted to just understand, especially when we're looking at the issue of sustainability in the project cycle, what role does change management play in ensuring that the staff at the local authority or in the civil society organization that are pushing that agenda for reform plays? Because I think one of the issues for us to be able to, one of the issues that I've seen is immediately the project ends, you realize, especially in local authorities, that even those officers that were part of the project implementation, they choose the best practices that they learned because they were not institutionalized. They get to forget, or if there's a new project that has come and there are lessons that were learned from the other project, they don't want to incorporate them in the new project. They want, again, to go through the same either trainings and issues like that. So my question is, how can we incorporate change management from the start of the project, and what role can it play in terms of sustainability? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Abraham. And I think you touch on a very key aspect, right? Change management. If you remember, I talked about institutionalization. To institutionalize and embed some of these changes in people's job descriptions, in the way the department functions, is at the heart of any reform, because reform is about managing change. And sometimes we can focus so much on the tools that we forget the people who are meant to implement those tools. And that's why I started by being provocative, saying the tools, you may call them what you may, but you have to think, what is it that you wanted? At the back of each of these tools, there's a reform that you wanted. That's what should be at the center, rather than the tool itself, because you can take away the tool, but if you start to institutionalize certain behaviors and certain practices, that helps. I'll give you examples. If you look at even with when the decentralization really started to kick off in Zambia in terms of moving staff from central government, for example, to local authorities, there was a lot of pushback, and there were a lot of excuses. For example, the law says we have to pay off staff and so on. And over discussions, people started to see, to find innovative ways of getting that goal done. Okay, so instead of saying we are moving people, they I think they use the word it's not secondment. Danny, what's the word? Attaching.
Attachment.
Because, exactly. That came out of a lot of debate, because you needed to find a solution that worked. And part of the change management I remember some of our colleagues in the health sector were very, very upset about it. You know, I can't be managed by a town clerk who is less, has done less study and so on and so forth. But as they started to understand that they had more resource working with the local authorities, decisions were being made quicker, they started to buy in. I mean, I'm sure you know much more about this than I do. But change management should be a key factor in the reform. And so rather than focus, as you develop a tool, you should always be thinking, how do we, every reform needs change management. And you're right that we don't emphasize that enough. So we end up looking at these things as silos. You cannot talk about SDGs and changing the way a government works without talking about how it budgets, who's involved in the consultation, because at local government, at least in Zambia, there's always a period where the budget is subject to public scrutiny before it's approved. Who's coming to those meetings? And so some of that change management can be slowly built in that way. In terms of the staff themselves, I think, you know, when I was managing the USAID project, one of the things that I banned my staff from doing was ever claiming USAID Local Impact was doing anything, because we weren't. We were meant to be a partner. So we worked more with those local authorities that wanted the reform and less with those that didn't want. And for those that didn't want, we found a space where they were interested in something. And if we always, you know, I had to start with the principal officers, the most senior, to find something that they were interested in, that they wanted to take forward, where there was mutual agreement and mutual benefit. Where they didn't, we couldn't push, because unless there's a directive that comes from the president or somewhere, and you know, it's very hard for a reform to stick where in a situation where the reformers themselves don't want it. And we have to admit that sometimes we have the opportunity isn't there to take that reform forward. But we have to be very true to ourselves, have the humility to accept that, you know, reform does not work on previous cycles. Sometimes reform takes cycles and cycles of investment. And I think the third thing is also around donors, and maybe the lack of money would be helpful, because when donors come, I think Danny will remember that in the project, I refused to develop anything new, except where we were adding value. If someone had already developed something, we use it. So cooperating partners can be a problem themselves in wanting to put a flag on tools or whatever it is. But if we could spend more time thinking, how do we build on what's already there, then that can help. But a lot of that also depends on the staff themselves being more empowered. And it would be interesting to hear, Abraham, why, you know, or how projects can better listen to local government or municipal staff as well. Because we go to the same universities, and then suddenly when I run a project or I'm on a project, I'm more intelligent than you. So how do you also help us get a bit more humility? Because you know this stuff and we should be learning from you.
Thank you very much. Tendai had her hand up. I'll give her a chance, then Mutale, you come through. Tendai, if your question still stands, please proceed, and then we'll give the opportunity to Mutale. See, Tendai, I can see you are online. Deuce, is your question still coming through, or we give the opportunity to Mutale? Okay, Mutale, please ask your question. When Tendai is ready, she'll do so.
Danny, for me, mine is not really a question, but just to acknowledge what Wilfred said in the end, because for me, what I've understood in the concept of change management and institutionalizing reforms is that even in case-by-case scenario, we also need to understand, I think I've liked his last point in that you need to understand what reforms work for which local authorities or which area. Because sometimes not really studying what reforms would work for who is actually very difficult to institutionalize and difficult to even implement change management. So I feel like when you understand what reforms will work for which areas, it actually makes it easier to actually institutionalize, because people accept that this is something that they need to work on and this is a problem that they need to solve, or something that they need to change themselves. And it becomes very easy to actually institutionalize, coming way down from the substructures all the way to the principal officers having it in their performance contract. So I think I would like to really agree on that sometimes it's a case-by-case situation where you really need to understand which reforms would work for which areas.
Thank you, Mutale, for that addition. Do I see any hand here, or people are happy with the presentation so far? We don't have anything to ask.
Hello, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Go ahead,
Hello.
please. Yes, please go ahead.
Sorry, I couldn't raise my hand. I think the device that I'm using, it doesn't have that option. My name is Tanya Moyo. I'm from Zimbabwe, and maybe just to add up on what the previous commenter said about how you need to look at which reform or tool works best, and looking at the experience in Zimbabwe, usually there are differences in terms of the rural part of the areas in Zimbabwe or the urban parts, and of which in rural areas mostly, if you want to introduce something, the first point of call is the traditional leaders. If you fail to win favor with the traditional leaders, whatever you introduce won't be it won't be embraced, and there won't be a sense of ownership to whatever is introduced. Unlike in urban areas, I suppose it's more about making sure you include the young population, the Gen Zs, as we usually say now. So yeah, I think it depends, and you need to know what works best for each particular local authority, whether it's urban or rural. Thank you.
And I think just to acknowledge both Mutale and Tanya's contributions, it's, when we talk about political utility, once you understand context from the beginning, the design of the project should not be done away from the partner that you claim to be supporting. Yes, the broad framework might be written elsewhere, but in order to take these reforms, every place has its own context, and the more we understand that, the better. So we have to, when you're coming in from a project design, or you want to indeed influence anyone, you first seek to understand, right, before you can be understood. And I think sometimes we come in with project timelines, project, sometimes tick box results that we want to produce without thinking about the context. And I think there's a duty for all of us, and especially our colleagues who work in local government, whether at the central government level or municipalities. Even with these tools that have been developed, what ICLD has done is given you the backbone. How you did now develop those and use them in your respective local authorities depends on you. No one knows those localities better than you do. So it's really important that that ownership is built from the beginning rather than at the end. It's better to spend a longer time in inception where you are talking to the partner so that they fully buy in to the reform. And if it's something that they really want, it's not about buying in, it's a sharing of ideas, and from there they also pick what works for them. So I think that's really important for projects to do at the beginning, rather than feel we've designed and then we leave those with you. It becomes much more difficult to utilize. So thank you for those contributions. But the question also, I think, Danny, in terms of, it would be good to understand from colleagues who, the alumni here, what makes it so difficult to be able to speak to projects at the beginning to ensure that the reforms that we all support are reforms that actually make sense in the locality.
So there is a question. Anybody willing to take it up?
Yeah,
Hi, Danny.
Yes. Who'd like to come in?
Maybe let me give you an opportunity to John first.
Okay, thank you so much, Danny. My name is John Gitonga. I'm from Nairobi, Kenya. I just wanted to appreciate the speaker for his insights, and I know from the East African part we also suffer some of these challenges, and some of the solutions that he's been proposing are something that we can be able to share with my colleagues. I also like about the contributions that I'm getting from my colleagues. These are very insightful things. Although I joined a little bit, I hope it will be online where I can be able to listen and take notes better. But I really appreciate the insights from the speaker. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, John. Then Abraham or anybody else also who is willing to just respond to the question that was asked? Abraham, you go first,
Yes,
and then yeah.
Yes, I think first and foremost, I want to address the first part. What role can we play in ensuring that these tools that are developed are basically institutionalized? And I think the key aspect is that as the project is being designed, there should be certain components within the project that allow for co-creation of the outcomes and outputs. I think it's very important that there's that flexibility, because it allows local input into the project design and also the ownership of the project. So I think that is one of the issues that needs to be done. And I think it also relates to the second aspect. At the onset of the project, I think it is very important to also highlight your expectation as the beneficiaries of that project. It's not just about looking at the benefits that comes, okay, there'll be this, that will be installed, there'll be bores that will be drilled, or there'll be these projects that will be put in place. But also you need to be able to say, okay, how do they relate to, say, the local development plans? Do they speak to any component of your integrated plan? What indicators are contained in your planning documents that will be able to answer to those interventions that the project is bringing? Once you have that conversation and you make it plain and clear to the partners, I think it will help in terms of meeting or sustaining long-term benefits and also adoption of the reforms that the project seeks to bring forward. So I think they need to have an honest conversation without just looking at, okay, this is what they want to achieve. It's not about what they want to achieve. It's supposed to be a win-win situation. So in as much as they have objectives and outcomes that they want to achieve from the project side, we also need to bring to the table what is contained in the planning document and what is the direction of the districts, the areas of need, so that in that way you're able to balance up. I think that can help in terms of project sustainability. I submit.
Thank you. Chileshe, I can see that you also have your hand up. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. I just wanted to just add on what Abraham has said with regards to institutionalizing. I think from the very onset, it's important to bring everyone concerned aboard. I think what kills us mostly is that we work and we don't want to, and it's this department that is championing a particular project. It's only that department that is putting on and finalizing those plans. However, also it is important to just streamline everything that we are doing with the actual plans, the integrated development plans, the budgeting, as well as the action plans for a municipality, for instance. I think that way it will be easier to institutionalize, streamline, as well as sustain whatever we learn.
Thank you, Chileshe, for that. I saw, Mutali, you had your hand up. Do you still want to contribute?
I think, Danny, I think it's very similar to what has already been said. I feel it's more of ensuring that the tools, the role that we play is more of ensuring that the tools are as localized as possible, make them be as much relatable to the situations of the people that you are dealing with, and also just ensuring that they fit into already existing frameworks, so that you're not bringing in something new and you start trying to come up with different dynamics of ensuring sustainability.
Thank you very much. Esther, please go ahead.
Okay, so mine is more of a question. So in situations where you are trying to implement what may seem like, so in situations where you're trying to introduce or implement what may seem like a radical change or a radical project, would you then say it wouldn't be a wise idea to go with something radical? For example, if the project is dealing with new cultural shifts, okay? So say inclusion, for example, which is not necessarily an idea that we've embraced yet. So it wouldn't have the political utility, the institutional fit, the staff routine, but it has the citizen demand. How then do you go about introducing that completely new idea and still make it sustainable?
All right. Thank you for that question.
Hi, Danny. Do you want me to give a thought?
Yes, please go ahead.
Sure. No, and thank you very much. That's an interesting question, and I think everything that we try and institute has to have some level of either push or a cost to politicians. I think we're all working on governance. That's how we know. And sometimes when you're bringing in new things, it has to be subtle. It could be you opening up spaces where people who are excluded were not invited. I'll give you examples. When we're doing the USAID local impact project, one area we found that citizens were not actually being engaged was on the district development coordinating committees, okay? Civil society were invited. In fact, even projects like USAID would be invited to that meeting, but the ward development committees were not. We spoke to we piloted it, I think it was in Mpika, by speaking to the DC and just asking him, what do you care about? And they said, well, you know, I'm worried about whether these bridges are happening and contractors are not finishing their work, for example. And we said, what would you say to bringing some of the community representatives from those areas into the DDCC so that they are able to give their experience? Now, in that case, we knew that we had a lot of objection, including from some very senior government officials who would say there's no framework for WDCs to participate in DDCCs. And we asked them, can a citizen observe a DDCC meeting? And they said yes. So then why couldn't we bring in the Ward Development Committee members as observers? All right. So they came in and they were asked to give some evidence on something. I think they were able to challenge a project that they said the contractor or someone said they were doing. So things like that help, and you have to find subtle ways of starting to introduce some of those initiatives. You cannot go head to head with them. It's finding ways of bringing them on board without threatening, the current status quo. This is where you also work with others. When you understand the context, you will know. In Africa, most of us will know that when you have a problem, whether it's at home or with someone, we usually go through other interlocutors because we know maybe our parent or our spouse may not listen to us at that time or at that period. And so we go and find others who can intercede for us. So these are cultural things that we do. Can we find, people who are able to go and speak truth to power? And sometimes it may be when you have a chance for a project, as you did, for example, with ICLD or US Local Impact, it gives us a chance as outsiders to be able to have those conversations that you may not be able to have. That helps to shift some of that thinking. So there's no straight answer. You have to understand what the context is and find people or places or opportunities for some of those things to be introduced. Certainly, if you go in with an idea that most oppose, it may die. And sometimes it's just timing. So there are certain things that you will have to accept the timing isn't right, and you wait until the time is right to introduce them. Hopefully that gives you at least some, it doesn't give you a black or white answer, but gives you a way of thinking about some of those challenges.
Thank you very much. Do we have any more questions, comments? All right. I don't see any hand that is up. So I assume that we are satisfied up to this point. And since there's nothing more to add, I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to Wilf for putting up this wonderful presentation. I hope and I believe that we've all found it useful, not just now, but even in the work that we do in our institutions or in the projects that we are supporting in the various organizations that we are coming from. So at this moment, our Alumni Talk has come to an end. Thanks for the good attendance that we have recorded today. We'll have some more of such talks as time goes on. So thank you very much, and have a great afternoon or evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.